Welcome to Quick Classic Books, where the greatest stories ever written are transformed into engaging narrations that capture both the essence and the elegance of literature's most enduring masterworks. Today, we journey into the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London to explore Robert Louis Stevenson's haunting tale of science, morality, and the terrifying duality that exists within every human soul. In the gaslit thoroughfares of 1886, where respectability masked the darker impulses of human nature, there unfolded one of the most extraordinary and disturbing cases in the annals of scientific investigation. The great metropolis hummed with the confidence of an empire at its zenith. Yet beneath the veneer of civilized progress lurked mysteries that would challenge every assumption about the nature of human identity and moral responsibility. Mysteries that continue to captivate readers more than a century after Stevenson first committed this chilling account to paper. This is the account of Dr. Henry Jekyll, a respected physician and researcher whose brilliant mind led him into territories of knowledge that were never meant for human exploration. It is also the story of Edward Hyde, a figure so repellent and evil that his very presence inspired immediate revulsion in all who encountered him. Most remarkably of all, it is the tale of how these two seemingly opposite individuals were revealed to be manifestations of a single human soul, one that had been artificially divided against itself through the dangerous application of chemical science. The events chronicled here were witnessed by some of London's most respectable citizens. Gabriel Utterson, a lawyer whose methodical nature and unwavering integrity made him the confidant of the city's elite. Dr. Hasty Lanyon, a distinguished physician whose rational mind was shattered by revelations that defied every principle of natural philosophy. And Poole, a faithful servant whose loyalty was tested by circumstances that lay far beyond the normal scope of domestic service. Their testimonies, carefully preserved and thoughtfully considered, provide a window into a world where the boundaries between good and evil, between scientific achievement and moral catastrophe, became tragically blurred. The story they tell serves as both a thrilling mystery and a profound meditation on the dual nature that exists within every human heart, the eternal struggle between noble impulses and darker desires that defines the human condition. In an age when scientific progress promised to unlock the secrets of existence itself, Dr. Jekyll's experiments represented both the highest aspirations of human knowledge and its most dangerous potential for corruption. His discoveries forced all who learned of them to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and to question whether some forms of knowledge were too perilous for mortal minds to possess. The London of this tale was a city of stark contrasts, elegant squares where the wealthy pursued their refined pleasures, and narrow alleys where poverty and desperation created their own harsh laws. It was a place where respectability was prized above all other virtues, yet where the night concealed activities that would have shocked the daylight conscience of even the most worldly citizens. In this environment of moral complexity and social contradiction, the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde unfolded with an inevitability that would horrify all who witnessed its conclusion. What follows is not merely a chronicle of criminal activities or scientific experimentation gone awry, but rather an exploration of the fundamental questions that have haunted humanity since the dawn of consciousness. What is the true nature of good and evil? Can these opposing forces within human character be separated and controlled? And what price must be paid by those who seek to transcend the moral limitations that define human existence? The answers to these questions, as revealed through the testimony of reliable witnesses and the final confession of Dr. Jekyll himself, will challenge every assumption about human nature and leave readers pondering the delicate balance that separates civilized behavior from the chaos that lurks within every human soul. This is a story that begins with a simple observation about duality in human character and evolves into one of the most profound and disturbing investigations ever undertaken into the relationship between scientific ambition and moral responsibility. Prepare yourself, therefore, for an account that will take you into the darkest corners of both London's streets and the human heart, where the line between victim and perpetrator, between healer and destroyer, becomes terrifyingly blurred. The strange case that unfolds in these pages serves as both entertainment and warning, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, and that the pursuit of knowledge without wisdom may lead not to enlightenment, but to destruction. Join us now as we delve into this timeless tale of science and morality, of respectability and hidden darkness. Brought to you with the careful attention to literary excellence that defines every quick classic book's presentation. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Door. In the fog-shrouded streets of London, during the final decades of the 19th century, there lived a man whose reputation for respectability was matched only by his devotion to the art of law. Gabriel John Utterson, a lawyer of 57 years, walked the gaslit thoroughfares each Sunday morning with the precision of a man who had never missed an appointment in his adult life. His companion on these ritualistic strolls was Richard Enfield, a distant cousin whose disposition toward adventure provided a curious counterpoint to Utterson's methodical nature. It was on one such Sunday morning in October of 1886 that their customary route brought them to a narrow side street that branched off from the bustling commercial district. The morning was crisp and clear, with the autumn sun beginning to burn away the last vestiges of London's perpetual fog. They had set out at 9:30, as was their custom, allowing themselves sufficient time for their leisurely constitutional before the midday meal. The cobblestones here seemed perpetually damp, as though the morning mist clung more tenaciously to this particular passage than to the broader avenues beyond. Victorian terraced houses lined both sides of the street, their brick facades darkened by decades of London's soot, yet maintained with the careful attention that marked respectable middle-class dwellings. Among these uniform structures stood one building that drew the eye for all the wrong reasons. Where its neighbors presented welcoming front gardens and polished brass door fixtures, this particular edifice showed only a blank wall to the street, broken by a single door that appeared to have been sealed against both weather and visitors. The door itself was painted a deep green that had long since faded to the color of verdigris, and its brass fittings had acquired the dull patina that spoke of years without proper maintenance. Enfield paused before this unremarkable yet somehow unsettling portal, his walking stick tapping against the pavement in a rhythm that suggested deep contemplation. "You know, Utterson," he began, his voice carrying the particular tone that indicated he was about to share one of his many London adventures. "There is a most extraordinary story connected with that door." The lawyer adjusted his black silk hat against the morning chill and regarded his cousin with the patient expression of a man accustomed to unusual tales. At 57, Utterson had developed the ability to listen without judgment, a skill that served him well both in his legal practice and in his friendship with the more impetuous Enfield, who was some 15 years his junior. "I was returning home rather late one evening," Enfield continued, his gaze fixed upon the mysterious entrance, "when I witnessed something that has troubled my sleep for weeks afterward. The hour was perhaps 3 in the morning, and the streets were as empty as they ever become in this great city of ours. The morning air carried the familiar sense of coal smoke and dampness that characterized London in autumn." Utterson found himself drawn into his cousin's narrative, despite his natural inclination toward skepticism regarding tales of midnight adventure. "I was walking at a brisk pace," Enfield explained, "for the night was cold and I was eager to reach my own hearth, when I observed two figures approaching from opposite directions. The first was a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years of age, who appeared to be running some errand for her family. She moved with the quick, purposeful gait of a child accustomed to navigating London streets, even at such an unusual hour." Utterson's expression grew more attentive, for any story involving a child in the dangerous hours after midnight commanded his immediate concern. His legal practice had brought him into contact with numerous cases where the vulnerable had suffered at the hands of those who preyed upon the innocent. "The second figure," Enfield continued, his voice dropping to a more serious tone, "was that of a man of perhaps 40 years, walking with apparent purpose, but in a manner that struck me as somehow predatory. There was something about his gait, about the set of his shoulders, that suggested a person entirely lacking in the common courtesies that govern civilized society." The cousin paused in his narrative, seeming to gather his thoughts as he recalled the disturbing scene. Around them, the Sunday morning bustle of London was beginning to stir. The distant sounds of early church services could be heard from various directions, and the occasional carriage rolled past on the broader thoroughfares, carrying families to their weekly worship. "What happened next," Enfield said, "defies both explanation and excuse. The man, without any provocation whatsoever, collided deliberately with the child. But this was no mere accident of navigation. He trampled her underfoot with such callous disregard for her welfare that she was left crying upon the pavement, clearly injured and terrified. Utterson's jaw tightened with indignation. "Surely you intervened on the child's behalf." "Indeed I did," Enfield replied with evident satisfaction. "I raised such a cry that several other witnesses appeared, including the child's own family members who had been searching for her. We surrounded the perpetrator, and I can tell you that the mood of our impromptu gathering was decidedly hostile." The lawyer nodded approvingly, for he had long believed that the protection of the innocent was the fundamental duty of any civilized person. "And what explanation did this villain offer for his unconscionable behavior?" "None whatsoever," Enfield answered. "He appeared completely unmoved by the child's distress and showed not the slightest remorse for his actions. It was as though he regarded other human beings as mere obstacles to be cleared from his path, regardless of the suffering he might cause." The morning sun continued to strengthen, gradually dispelling the last traces of London's morning fog and casting longer shadows across the narrow street. The mysterious door seemed to absorb rather than reflect this growing light, maintaining its air of secretive isolation even as the day brightened around it. "We demanded compensation for the child's suffering," Enfield continued, "and to our surprise, the man agreed without argument. But here is where the tale becomes truly extraordinary. He led us directly to this very door, produced a key, and disappeared inside for perhaps 10 minutes. Utterson studied the unprepossessing portal with renewed interest, and when he emerged, he returned with a bank draft for £100, made payable to the child's family," Enfield replied. "But here is the curious detail that has haunted me ever since. The signature upon that draft belonged to a man whose reputation in London society is beyond reproach, a gentleman I have met socially on numerous occasions." The lawyer's professional instincts immediately engaged with this information. Bank drafts bearing forged signatures were serious criminal matters, but the alternative explanation, that a respected member of society would voluntarily compensate the victim of such a brutal assault, seemed equally improbable. "You suspect forgery?" Utterson inquired. "That was my initial assumption," Enfield admitted. "But I made discreet inquiries, and I can assure you that the bank honored the draft without question. The signature was apparently genuine, though how such a document came to be in the possession of that particular individual remains a complete mystery." They stood in contemplative silence for several moments, both men studying the enigmatic door as though it might reveal its secrets through careful observation. The building behind it showed no signs of regular habitation, no smoke from chimneys, no evidence of window cleaning, no indication that anyone lived or worked within its walls. "Have you attempted to learn more about the building's occupant?" Utterson asked. "I have made several discreet inquiries," Enfield replied, "but I have discovered remarkably little concrete information. The property appears to belong to one Dr. Henry Jekyll, a gentleman of considerable reputation in both scientific and social circles. Yet I have never observed any evidence of his presence here, nor have I encountered anyone who claims to have visited him at this address." The name stirred a memory in Utterson's methodical mind. "Dr. Jekyll, yes, I believe I am acquainted with the gentleman, though our paths cross infrequently. He maintains a residence in one of the more fashionable squares, as I recall, and is regarded as a man of both substantial wealth and unimpeachable character, which makes the connection to our mysterious night prowler all the more puzzling," Enfield observed. "I cannot conceive of any legitimate reason why such a respectable gentleman would provide financial compensation for the actions of such a thoroughly disreputable individual." As their conversation continued, the sounds of London's Sunday morning routine grew more pronounced around them. The distant chiming of church bells began to mark the quarter hour, their bronze voices calling the faithful to services across the sprawling metropolis. Utterson consulted his gold pocket watch, a gift from his late father upon his admission to the bar, and noted that their walk had already consumed the better part of an hour. "Perhaps," he suggested thoughtfully, "there is a family connection that explains the doctor's involvement. Brothers, cousins, or other relations often find themselves compelled to address the misdeeds of wayward family members, regardless of personal cost or embarrassment." Enfield considered this possibility with evident skepticism. "I suppose such an explanation is possible, though I must tell you that the physical resemblance between the two men was minimal. The gentleman whose signature appeared on the bank draft is known to be a man of middle years, distinguished bearing, and pleasant countenance. The individual who committed the assault was considerably younger, shorter in stature, and possessed of a countenance that could only be described as actively repellent." "Repellent in what manner?" Utterson inquired. his legal training having taught him to seek specific details rather than general impressions. There was something fundamentally wrong about his appearance. Enfield struggled to articulate his impression. Not any single feature that one could identify as particularly objectionable, but rather an overall effect that inspired immediate dislike and distrust. Several of the witnesses commented upon this phenomenon. We all found ourselves experiencing an instinctive aversion to the man that went far beyond our natural reaction to his criminal behavior. This description troubled Utterson more than he cared to admit. Throughout his legal career, he had encountered numerous individuals whose actions were reprehensible, yet he had always been able to maintain professional objectivity regarding their personal characteristics. The idea of a person whose mere appearance inspired universal revulsion suggested something beyond the normal spectrum of human variation. "And you say this individual possessed a key to Dr. Jekyll's property?" he asked. "Without question," Enfield confirmed. "He produced it immediately and used it with the confidence of long familiarity. There was no fumbling with the lock, no hesitation about which key to use. Clearly, he had legitimate access to the premises." The implications of this detail added yet another layer of complexity to an already perplexing situation. If Dr. Jekyll had indeed granted access to his property to such an unsavory individual, it suggested either extremely poor judgment on the doctor's part or some compelling circumstance that forced his hand. "I confess," Utterson said slowly, "that your tale has aroused my professional curiosity. Dr. Jekyll and I move in similar social circles, and I have always regarded him as a gentleman of impeccable character and sound judgment. If he has indeed become involved with the sort of individual you describe, there may be circumstances that warrant investigation." Enfield nodded with evident relief. "I hoped you might see the matter in that light. While I am not naturally inclined toward gossip or interference in others' affairs, the welfare of that child and the broader question of public safety seem to demand some form of inquiry." As they resumed their Sunday morning walk, taking their time to process the implications of what they had discussed, both men found their thoughts occupied by the mysterious door and its even more mysterious occupant. The London streets around them gradually filled with the familiar rhythms of Victorian Sunday life. Families dressed in their finest clothes making their way to various churches, shopkeepers preparing their establishments for the abbreviated Sunday trade, and the ever-present background hum of the great city pursuing its weekly rituals. The crisp October air and steady pace of their constitutional provided the perfect atmosphere for contemplation, and as they made their way back toward the more respectable districts where they both resided, the strange tale seemed to take on an even more ominous character. By the time the church bells began to chime 11 o'clock, marking the beginning of the main morning services, both men carried with them the unsettling awareness that something was amiss in their ordered world. The strange case they had discussed would prove to be only the beginning of a series of events that would challenge everything they believed about human nature, scientific progress, and the thin veneer of civilization that separated respectable society from the darker impulses that lurked within the human heart. Chapter 2. The Will of Dr. Jekyll. The following Tuesday evening found Gabriel Utterson in his study, surrounded by the comfortable accoutrements of a successful legal practice. Leather-bound volumes lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their gilt lettering catching the warm glow of the gas lamps that illuminated his mahogany desk. Outside, the October rain drummed steadily against the windows, creating that peculiar sense of isolation and security that came with being warm and dry within one's own sanctuary while the elements raged beyond. Utterson had spent the better part of 2 days attempting to dismiss his cousin's strange tale from his thoughts, but professional curiosity had proven stronger than his natural inclination to avoid involvement in matters that did not directly concern his clients. The combination of Dr. Jekyll's respected reputation and the mysterious individual with access to his property had created a puzzle that his methodical mind found impossible to ignore. Rising from his leather chair, Utterson moved to the iron safe that occupied a corner of his study. The combination was known only to himself, and the safe contained the most sensitive documents entrusted to his care, wills, contracts, and confidential papers that represented the private affairs of London's most prominent citizens. He had been Dr. Jekyll's legal advisor for the better part of 15 years, and he distinctly recalled preparing a document that had troubled him at the time of its creation. The will of Dr. Henry Jekyll was filed under the letter J in Utterson's meticulous system, and he withdrew it now with the same careful attention he brought to all professional matters. The document was written on heavy paper and bore the formal language that characterized legal instruments of the period. Yet, even upon its initial preparation, Utterson had found its provisions both unusual and disturbing. Settling back in his chair, the lawyer examined the will by lamplight, noting once again the peculiar clause that had caused him such professional discomfort. The document began conventionally enough, with the standard declarations of sound mind and proper legal capacity. Dr. Jekyll's considerable fortune, estimated at some £250,000, was to be distributed among various charitable institutions and distant relatives in the event of his natural death. However, it was the provision for an alternative circumstance that had originally caused Utterson such concern. In addition to addressing the standard contingency of death, the will contained an unusual clause that provided for the complete transfer of Jekyll's estate to one Edward Hyde in the event of Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months. This Edward Hyde was described in the document simply as "my friend and beneficiary," with no additional details regarding his background, relationship to the doctor, or qualifications to manage such a substantial inheritance. Most troubling of all, the will specified that no questions were to be asked, and no inquiries made regarding Hyde's background or whereabouts, even in the event that he claimed the entire estate under the disappearance clause. Utterson removed his spectacles and cleaned them thoughtfully, a habit that indicated deep concentration. Throughout his legal career, he had prepared numerous wills containing unusual provisions, but he had never encountered a document that seemed so deliberately designed to prevent investigation into the circumstances of its execution. The name Edward Hyde stirred no recognition in his memory, despite his extensive knowledge of London society and his particular familiarity with Dr. Jekyll's social circle. This anonymity was itself suspicious, for Jekyll moved among the scientific and social elite of the city, and most of his associates were well-known figures in their respective fields. More troubling still was the ease with which the disappearance clause could be invoked. 3 months was a remarkably brief period to establish legal presumption of permanent absence, and the prohibition against investigation seemed designed to prevent any inquiry into whether such disappearance might be voluntary rather than the result of misfortune. The lawyer rose and moved to his window, where the gaslight from the street below created shifting patterns through the rain-streaked glass. London after dark had always struck him as a city of dual nature. The respectable districts where gas lamps and police constables maintained order and safety, and the darker areas where poverty and desperation created their own harsh rules of survival. The timing of his cousin's disturbing tale and his renewed examination of Jekyll's will seemed too coincidental to ignore. Could the mysterious Edward Hyde mentioned in the legal document be the same individual who had so brutally assaulted the child and then produced a bank draft bearing Dr. Jekyll's signature? If such a connection existed, it would explain several puzzling elements of Enfield's account. Hyde's possession of a key to Jekyll's property would be entirely reasonable if he were indeed the doctor's designated heir and trusted associate. Similarly, his access to Jekyll's financial resources would account for his ability to produce immediate compensation for his victim. Yet this explanation raised even more disturbing questions. Why would a respected gentleman like Dr. Jekyll associate himself with someone capable of such callous violence? What circumstances could possibly justify granting such extensive access to one's property and resources to an individual of apparently questionable character? Utterson returned to his desk and lit a second lamp, casting additional light across the legal document. He examined the signatures with particular care, noting that both Jekyll's mark and those of the witnesses appeared genuine. The will had been prepared in his own office under standard procedures, with proper identification of the testator and appropriate legal formalities. The witnesses had been 2 of his own clerks, both men of unquestionable integrity who had worked in his office for more than a decade. Their signatures confirmed that Dr. Jekyll had appeared in sound mind and had declared the document to represent his true intentions without any evidence of coercion or undue influence. This established authenticity made the will's provisions all the more puzzling. Jekyll had clearly intended to create the unusual arrangement, and he had done so with full awareness of its implications. Whatever his motivations, They were sufficient to overcome what must have been considerable reservations about the wisdom of such unprecedented legal provisions. A soft knock at his study door interrupted Utterson's contemplation. His manservant, Poole, entered carrying a silver tray with the Evening Post and a crystal decanter of brandy that had become part of the lawyer's nightly routine. "The evening letters, sir," Poole announced in the quiet, efficient manner that had characterized his service for more than 20 years. "And I took the liberty of bringing your usual refreshment." Utterson accepted the correspondence with a nod of gratitude. Poole had been in service with the Utterson family since Gabriel's father practiced law from the same chambers, and his discretion regarding confidential matters was absolute. "Poole," the lawyer said thoughtfully, "in your years of service, have you ever encountered the name Edward Hyde in connection with any of my clients or their affairs?" The manservant considered the question with the careful attention he brought to all inquiries regarding professional matters. "I cannot recall that particular name, sir, though of course I encounter numerous individuals in the course of managing your appointments and correspondence. The individual in question would likely be a younger man, perhaps someone who might have visited Dr. Jekyll either here or at the doctor's own residence," Utterson elaborated. "Dr. Jekyll has been a valued client for many years," Poole replied, "and I've had occasion to meet many of his associates when they called upon you for legal consultations. However, I cannot place anyone named Edward Hyde among his usual companions." This negative response confirmed Utterson's growing suspicion that Hyde was either a very recent addition to Jekyll's circle or someone who deliberately maintained a low profile in respectable society. Either possibility suggested circumstances that warranted further investigation. After Poole withdrew, Utterson poured himself a modest measure of brandy and settled back in his chair to consider his options. His professional obligations required him to respect client confidentiality and avoid unnecessary interference in private affairs. Yet his friendship with Jekyll and his concern for public safety suggested that some form of discreet inquiry might be both appropriate and necessary. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, the bells of St. Paul's Cathedral marked the hour of 9 o'clock. London was settling into its evening routine, with respectable citizens secure in their homes, while the city's darker elements began their nocturnal activities. Utterson made his decision with the same methodical consideration he brought to all professional matters. He would arrange a social visit with Dr. Jekyll under the pretext of discussing routine legal affairs. Such a meeting would provide an opportunity to assess the doctor's current state of mind and perhaps gain insight into his relationship with the mysterious Edward Hyde. The lawyer completed his examination of the will and returned it to his safe, but the troubling questions it raised remained very much on his mind. As he prepared for bed, Utterson found himself wondering whether his old friend had become involved in circumstances beyond his ability to control, and whether the respected Dr. Jekyll might be in need of assistance that only a trusted advisor could provide. Outside, London's fog began to gather in the streets, creating the perfect conditions for activities that preferred to remain hidden from public scrutiny. Somewhere in that vast metropolis, Edward Hyde was presumably going about his evening business, unaware that his connection to Dr. Jekyll had begun to attract the attention of one of the city's most methodical and persistent legal minds. Chapter 3. The Pursuit of Mr. Hyde. The opportunity for a social call upon Dr. Jekyll presented itself sooner than Utterson had anticipated. On the following Thursday afternoon, he received an invitation to a small dinner party at the home of Dr. Lanyon, a mutual friend whose medical practice had brought him into frequent contact with Jekyll over the years. The gathering was to celebrate Lanyon's recent appointment as a consulting physician to one of London's most prestigious hospitals, and the guest list included many of the city's leading medical and scientific figures. Dr. Hasty Lanyon maintained his residence in Cavendish Square, a location that reflected both his professional success and his position in London society. The Georgian townhouse had been in his family for 2 generations, and its elegant proportions and carefully maintained facade spoke of both wealth and refined taste. When Utterson arrived at the appointed hour of 7 o'clock, he found the drawing room filled with the sort of distinguished company that characterized London's intellectual elite. Dr. Jekyll was among the guests, and Utterson was pleased to note that his old friend appeared to be in excellent health and spirits. At 51 years of age, Jekyll retained the vigor and enthusiasm that had marked his younger years, and his conversation displayed the same keen intelligence that had made him one of London's most respected medical researchers. "My dear Utterson," Jekyll greeted him warmly, "what a pleasure to see you in purely social circumstances. I fear our recent meetings have been entirely concerned with the tedious details of legal and financial matters." The lawyer accepted a glass of excellent sherry from the circulating servant and settled into conversation with his host and fellow guests. The discussion ranged across the latest developments in medical science, recent discoveries in chemistry, and the broader questions of human nature that occupied the Victorian scientific mind. Dr. Lanyon, who had known Jekyll since their university days, seemed particularly interested in discussing his colleague's recent research activities. "Henry has been pursuing some rather extraordinary investigations," he told the assembled company, "though I must confess that some of his theories venture into territory that I find somewhat questionable from a scientific standpoint." Jekyll's response to this gentle criticism was notably defensive. "Medical science has always progressed through investigations that initially seem implausible to conventional thinking," he replied. "The great discoveries of our age have come from researchers willing to explore possibilities that their contemporaries dismissed as impossible." "Certainly," Lanyon agreed diplomatically, "but there must always be limits to how far we venture beyond established scientific principles. The reputation of our profession depends upon maintaining rigorous standards of evidence and logical reasoning." Utterson observed this exchange with the careful attention that his legal training had developed. There seemed to be an underlying tension between the two medical men that went beyond mere academic disagreement. Jekyll's manner suggested someone defending work that he knew to be controversial, while Lanyon's response indicated genuine concern about his colleague's research directions. As the evening progressed, Utterson found an opportunity to draw Jekyll aside for private conversation. The doctor's library provided a quiet setting away from the main gathering, and the lawyer broached the subject that had been occupying his thoughts since his conversation with Enfield. "Henry," he began carefully, "I hope you will not think me presumptuous if I inquire about a matter that has come to my attention through rather unusual circumstances." Jekyll's manner immediately became more guarded. "Of course, Gabriel. What matter concerns you?" "I have recently heard the name Edward Hyde mentioned in connection with some rather disturbing events," Utterson explained. "Since I recall that name appearing in certain legal documents I have prepared on your behalf, I wondered if you might be able to provide some clarification." The change in Jekyll's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. The color drained from his face, and his hands began to tremble slightly as he set down his glass of sherry. For several moments, he seemed unable to speak, and when he finally responded, his voice carried a quality that Utterson had never heard before. "Edward Hyde," Jekyll repeated slowly, as though the name itself caused him physical discomfort. "What exactly have you heard, and from whom?" Utterson related his cousin's account of the incident with the child, being careful to present only the factual details without speculation or judgment. He watched Jekyll's face carefully throughout the narrative, noting the various emotions that played across his friend's features: fear, guilt, resignation, and something that looked remarkably like despair. When the account was complete, Jekyll remained silent for several minutes, staring into the fire that warmed the library. Outside, the London fog was beginning to gather, creating the peculiar muffled quality of sound that marked autumn evenings in the great city. "I cannot deny," Jekyll finally said, "that Edward Hyde has access to my property and financial resources. The arrangement is a complex one, involving circumstances that I am not at liberty to discuss, even with so trusted a friend as yourself." "Henry," Utterson said gently, "you must understand that your will creates a most unusual legal situation. If this Hyde is indeed capable of the sort of behavior described by my cousin, you may be placing yourself in considerable jeopardy by granting him such extensive access to your affairs." Jekyll's laugh was bitter and entirely without humor. "Jeopardy, my dear Utterson, is a word that scarcely begins to describe my current situation. I am aware of Hyde's character, and I am aware of the risks involved in maintaining our association. Yet circumstances beyond my control make it impossible to alter the arrangements we have established." This response troubled the lawyer deeply, for it suggested that his friend might be subject to some form of coercion or blackmail. Such situations were not uncommon in London society, where ambitious individuals often sought to exploit the secrets or indiscretions of their social betters. "If you are being threatened or coerced in some manner," Utterson offered, Perhaps there are legal remedies that could provide protection. My practice has dealt with such matters on numerous occasions, always with the utmost discretion. No, Jekyll replied firmly. This is not a matter that law can address. The situation is entirely of my own creation, and I must bear the consequences of decisions I made willingly, though perhaps without full understanding of their implications. The conversation was interrupted by the return of other guests seeking books from Lanyon's extensive medical library. Jekyll used this distraction to excuse himself, but before leaving, he placed his hand on Utterson's shoulder with an expression of genuine gratitude. I appreciate your concern, Gabriel, and I value your friendship more than I can adequately express. If anything should happen to me, anything that might invoke the unusual provisions of my will, I ask only that you remember that Edward Hyde must be allowed to claim his inheritance without interference or investigation. These words, spoken with unmistakable sincerity and obvious distress, left Utterson with more questions than answers. As the evening concluded and the guests took their leave, he found himself walking the foggy streets of London with a deep sense of unease about his friend's circumstances. The lawyer's route home took him through several of the city's more fashionable districts, where gas lamps cast pools of yellow light through the thickening fog. Yet as he walked, Utterson found his thoughts drawn to the darker areas of London, where poverty and desperation created opportunities for the sort of individual who might prey upon gentlemen like Dr. Jekyll. Somewhere in the vast metropolis, Edward Hyde was presumably going about his evening activities, unaware that his actions were drawing attention from those capable of exposing whatever hold he might have over one of London's most respected citizens. The lawyer resolved to pursue the matter with the same methodical persistence he brought to all professional challenges, regardless of the personal risk such investigation might entail. The fog continued to thicken as Utterson made his way home, transforming the familiar streets of London into a mysterious landscape where anything might be lurking just beyond the range of vision. It seemed an entirely appropriate atmosphere for contemplating the strange case that had begun to occupy his thoughts, and he wondered whether the truth, when it was finally revealed, would prove to be more disturbing than the darkest possibilities he could imagine. Chapter 4. The Carew Murder. The month of October passed quietly for Gabriel Utterson, who found his professional duties consuming most of his waking hours as London's legal community prepared for the autumn session of the courts. His concerns about Dr. Jekyll's mysterious association with Edward Hyde had not diminished, but the pressing demands of his practice had prevented him from pursuing the matter with the thoroughness he felt it deserved. This period of relative calm was shattered on the morning of October 18th, when Poole arrived at his study carrying the Times of London and wearing an expression of unusual gravity. The front page of the newspaper carried a headline that immediately commanded Utterson's attention: Member of Parliament brutally murdered in Soho. The article that followed provided details of a crime so shocking that it had captured the attention of the entire city. Sir Danvers Carew, a member of Parliament known for his charitable work and progressive social views, had been discovered dead in a narrow street in one of London's less fashionable districts. The circumstances of his death were particularly horrific. He had been beaten to death with a walking stick, apparently during the late evening hours, when few witnesses would be present. According to the police report, the only witness to the crime had been a housemaid who observed the attack from her employer's upper-story window. Her testimony described seeing an elderly gentleman engaged in conversation with a younger man of apparently respectable appearance. The conversation had seemed cordial initially, but it had suddenly erupted into violence when the younger man had begun beating the older with savage intensity. The walking stick used in the attack had broken during the assault, and the police had recovered the splintered handle at the scene. They were seeking information regarding the stick's origin, as it appeared to be of particularly fine craftsmanship and might therefore be traceable to its original owner. What made this account especially significant to Utterson was the witness's description of the assailant. The housemaid had testified that the attacker was a man of perhaps 35 years, somewhat below average height, and possessed of such a repellent appearance that she had experienced an immediate and inexplicable aversion to him, despite the distance and darkness that prevented her from discerning his specific features. This description matched so closely with Enfield's account of the individual who had trampled the child that Utterson felt certain they were dealing with the same person. The implications were deeply troubling, for they suggested that Edward Hyde's capacity for violence extended far beyond casual cruelty toward children to include premeditated murder of respected public figures. The lawyer finished his breakfast quickly and made his way to Scotland Yard, where his professional connections provided access to Inspector Newcomen, the officer in charge of the Carew investigation. Newcomen was a conscientious professional who had worked with Utterson on several previous occasions, and he welcomed the lawyer's inquiry with the hope that it might provide useful information. "The case has peculiar features," Newcomen explained as he led Utterson through the corridors of the famous police headquarters. "We have a clear witness to the crime, and we have physical evidence in the form of the broken walking stick. Yet we have been unable to identify the assailant, despite the fact that his appearance seems to have made a memorable impression upon the witness." They paused before a table where the evidence from the crime scene had been carefully arranged. The broken walking stick immediately drew Utterson's attention, for it was indeed a piece of exceptional craftsmanship. The remaining handle was made of some exotic hardwood, with silver fittings that bore the marks of a skilled artisan. "I believe I can identify the original owner of this walking stick," Utterson said quietly. "It was a gift I presented to Dr. Henry Jekyll some years ago, in recognition of his successful completion of a particularly complex medical research project." Inspector Newcomen's expression sharpened with professional interest. "Dr. Jekyll is known to us as a gentleman of impeccable reputation. If this stick belongs to him, we must consider the possibility that he may have been another victim of the same assailant." "I think the situation may be rather more complicated than that," Utterson replied carefully. "I have reason to believe that Dr. Jekyll has granted access to his property and possessions to an individual named Edward Hyde. This Hyde matches the description provided by your witness, and he has previously been observed in circumstances that suggest a capacity for unprovoked violence." The inspector made careful notes as Utterson provided what information he could, without violating client confidentiality. The connection between Jekyll, Hyde, and the murder weapon was clearly significant, but it raised questions about the nature of their relationship and the extent to which the respected doctor might be involved in the criminal activities of his associate. "We shall need to interview Dr. Jekyll immediately," Newcomen decided. "If he can provide information about this Hyde individual's whereabouts and activities, it may lead to a swift resolution of the case." Utterson agreed to accompany the inspector to Jekyll's residence, both to ensure that proper legal procedures were followed and to provide whatever support his friend might need during what was certain to be a difficult interview. The carriage ride through London's afternoon traffic provided time for additional discussion of the case and its implications. Dr. Jekyll's home in the fashionable district near Russell Square reflected both his professional success and his position in London society. The Georgian townhouse had been purchased some years earlier when his medical practice and research activities began generating substantial income, and it was maintained with the careful attention to detail that characterized the residences of London's professional elite. When they were admitted to Jekyll's study, Utterson immediately noted that his friend appeared to be in a state of considerable agitation. The doctor's usually neat appearance was disheveled, his hands trembled slightly, and his manner suggested someone laboring under extreme emotional distress. "Henry," Utterson began gently, "Inspector Newcomen has some questions regarding a walking stick that may have belonged to you. I'm afraid the matter concerns the murder of Sir Danvers Carew, and the inspector needs your assistance in locating an individual who may have had access to your possessions." Jekyll's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. He became even paler than before, and for a moment, Utterson feared his friend might collapse entirely. When Jekyll finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Edward Hyde," he said simply. "You're looking for Edward Hyde." Inspector Newcomen confirmed that this was indeed the case, and he requested whatever information Jekyll could provide about Hyde's current whereabouts and activities. The doctor's response was surprising both for what it revealed and for what it seemed to conceal. "Hyde maintains lodgings in Soho," Jekyll said slowly, as though each word caused him physical pain. "The address is somewhere in the vicinity of Greek Street, though I cannot provide the exact number. He keeps irregular hours and maintains a very private existence." The doctor moved to his desk and withdrew a key from one of the drawers. "This will provide access to his lodgings," he said, extending the key toward Inspector Newcomen with obvious reluctance. "I ask only that you exercise discretion in your investigation, as the situation involves circumstances that I am not at liberty to discuss publicly." Inspector Newcomen accepted the key with professional courtesy, but his expression indicated that Jekyll's evasive responses had raised additional questions rather than providing satisfactory answers. "Dr. Jekyll, I must ask you to clarify the nature of your relationship with this Edward Hyde. The fact that you possess a key to his lodgings suggests a degree of intimacy that seems inconsistent with his apparent character." Jekyll's struggle to respond was painful to observe. He appeared to be wrestling with conflicting obligations, torn between his desire to assist the investigation and some other consideration that prevented him from speaking freely. When he finally replied, his words seemed carefully chosen to reveal as little as possible while still providing cooperation. "Edward Hyde has been a beneficiary of certain charitable efforts on my part," he said slowly. "There are individuals in our society who, through circumstances beyond their control, find themselves in need of assistance from those more fortunately situated. My relationship with Hyde falls into this category, though the specific details are confidential." This explanation satisfied neither Utterson nor Inspector Newcomen, for it failed to account for the extraordinary provisions of Jekyll's will or the degree of access Hyde apparently enjoyed to the doctor's property and resources. However, the inspector's immediate priority was locating a murder suspect, and he was prepared to defer more complex questions until Hyde had been apprehended. The three men made their way to Soho in the inspector's official carriage, traveling through the gradual transition from London's respectable districts to areas where poverty and desperation had created their own harsh social structures. The fog that perpetually shrouded the city seemed thicker here, as though the very atmosphere reflected the moral ambiguity of the neighborhood. Greek Street presented a facade of shabby respectability that barely concealed the various forms of vice and criminality that flourished in such areas. The buildings were older and less well-maintained than those in more fashionable districts, and the residents who moved through the narrow streets appeared to be either struggling to maintain respectability or had abandoned such pretenses entirely. Using the key provided by Jekyll, they gained access to a modest set of rooms on the second floor of a building that had obviously seen better days. Hyde's lodgings were spartanly furnished but meticulously clean, suggesting an occupant who valued order and privacy above comfort or display. The most striking feature of the rooms was their apparent abandonment. Clothes had been hastily removed from wardrobes, personal papers had been burned in the fireplace, and various items of value had obviously been taken away. It was clear that Hyde had departed quickly, perhaps within hours of the murder, and had attempted to eliminate any evidence that might connect him to his previous activities. Inspector Newcomen conducted a thorough search of the premises, while Utterson observed from a respectful distance. The professional efficiency with which the rooms had been cleared suggested that Hyde was no ordinary criminal, but rather someone with considerable experience in avoiding detection by legal authorities. Among the few items left behind was a portion of the broken walking stick, confirming the connection between Hyde and the Carew murder. The inspector also discovered several charred fragments of what appeared to be correspondence, though the pieces were too damaged to provide readable text. "He's fled London," Newcomen concluded after completing his examination. "The systematic removal of personal effects and the destruction of papers indicate someone who planned his escape carefully. We'll circulate his description to other police forces, but I suspect he's already well beyond our immediate reach." The return journey to Jekyll's residence was conducted in thoughtful silence, each man occupied with his own interpretation of what they had discovered. For Utterson, the evidence confirmed his worst fears about Hyde's character while raising new questions about Jekyll's involvement in circumstances that seemed to grow more dangerous with each revelation. When they arrived at the doctor's home, Jekyll received the news of Hyde's apparent flight with what appeared to be a mixture of relief and apprehension. His questions about the investigation's progress seemed driven more by anxiety about what might be discovered than by any desire to assist in Hyde's capture. "I must ask you, Dr. Jekyll," Inspector Newcomen said as he prepared to leave, "whether you have any reason to believe that this Edward Hyde might attempt to contact you or seek your assistance in evading justice." Jekyll's response was immediate and emphatic. "No," he said firmly. "I am certain that Edward Hyde will never trouble me again. Whatever circumstances brought us together in the past, they have been permanently resolved by recent events." After the inspector's departure, Utterson remained with his friend to discuss the implications of the day's discoveries. Jekyll's obvious distress and his evasive responses to official questions suggested that he was laboring under burdens that went far beyond mere association with a criminal. "Henry," Utterson said gently, "I hope you understand that this matter cannot simply be dismissed as resolved merely because Hyde has fled London. The questions raised by his access to your property and resources will require answers, both for legal authorities and for your own protection." Jekyll's reply revealed the depth of his emotional turmoil. "Gabriel, there are aspects of this situation that I cannot discuss with anyone, regardless of friendship or professional obligation. I ask only that you trust my judgment when I say that the danger Edward Hyde represented has passed, and that no further investigation is necessary or advisable." The lawyer found this response deeply unsatisfactory, but his friendship with Jekyll and his respect for client confidentiality prevented him from pressing the matter further at that time. As he took his leave and made his way home through London's fog-shrouded streets, Utterson carried with him the conviction that the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Edward Hyde was far from over, regardless of his friend's assurances. To the contrary, the murder of Sir Danvers Carew had transformed what had seemed to be a matter of personal indiscretion into a criminal investigation of the most serious nature. Somewhere beyond the reach of London's police, Edward Hyde continued to exist as a threat not only to Jekyll but to anyone who might have the misfortune to encounter him. The lawyer resolved to maintain his vigilance, despite his friend's insistence that the danger had passed. Chapter 5. The Strange Incident of Dr. Lanyon. The winter months of 1886 passed with unusual quietude in Gabriel Utterson's professional life. The murder of Sir Danvers Carew had captured public attention for several weeks, but the absence of any new developments in the case had gradually allowed other concerns to occupy London's collective consciousness. Edward Hyde had vanished as completely as though he had never existed, and despite extensive efforts by Scotland Yard and police forces throughout England, no trace of the fugitive had been discovered. Dr. Jekyll appeared to have been profoundly affected by these events, though whether from relief at Hyde's disappearance or from other causes, Utterson could not determine. His friend had become something of a recluse, declining social invitations and avoiding the scientific gatherings that had previously occupied much of his time. When Utterson called upon him, Jekyll seemed genuinely pleased to receive visitors, yet there was an underlying tension in his manner that suggested he remained troubled by matters he was unwilling to discuss. It was during this period of apparent calm that Utterson received an unexpected visitor at his chambers. Dr. Hasty Lanyon arrived without appointment on a cold February afternoon, and his appearance immediately aroused the lawyer's concern. The distinguished physician, normally a picture of robust health and professional confidence, appeared to have aged considerably in the months since their last meeting. Lanyon's face was gaunt, his hair had become noticeably grayer, and his hands showed a tremor that had not been present during their previous encounters. Most troubling of all was the expression in his eyes, a haunted quality that suggested he had witnessed something that challenged his fundamental understanding of the natural world. "Gabriel," Lanyon began without preamble, "I must speak with you regarding a matter of the utmost urgency and confidentiality. What I am about to tell you will seem incredible, perhaps even impossible, but I assure you that every word is the absolute truth." Utterson invited his visitor to be seated and offered refreshment, but Lanyon declined with a gesture that suggested his mission was too urgent to permit such courtesies. The physician remained standing, pacing the length of the study with the restless energy of a man driven by circumstances beyond his control. "3 nights ago," Lanyon continued, "I received a most extraordinary letter from Henry Jekyll. The message was written in his own hand, but the content was so unusual that I initially questioned whether he might be suffering from some form of mental disturbance." The lawyer's attention sharpened immediately, for any communication from Jekyll that could disturb a man of Lanyon's medical experience and professional judgment was cause for serious concern. "The letter," Lanyon explained, "contained urgent instructions for me to go immediately to Jekyll's house, gain entry to his laboratory using a key that would be provided by his manservant, and remove certain chemical preparations along with a particular notebook. These materials were to be brought to my own residence, where I was to await the arrival of an individual who would claim them on Jekyll's behalf." This account struck Utterson as both strange and potentially significant. Jekyll's laboratory was known to contain valuable equipment and dangerous chemicals, and the idea that he would entrust such materials to a third party suggested circumstances of unusual urgency. "Did the letter provide any explanation for these unusual requests?" Utterson inquired. "None whatsoever," Lanyon replied. Jekyll claimed that my compliance with his instructions was a matter of life and death, but he offered no details regarding the nature of the emergency or the identity of the individual who would collect the materials. The physician paused in his pacing and fixed Utterson with a stare that conveyed both urgency and desperation. "I have known Henry Jekyll for more than 20 years, he said. Despite our recent disagreements regarding his research directions, I could not ignore such a plea for assistance. I followed his instructions precisely." Utterson waited patiently for the continuation of this account, sensing that the most significant details were yet to be revealed. Outside his chambers, London's evening fog was beginning to gather, creating the muffled atmosphere that seemed to encourage confidential revelations. "The materials I retrieved from Jekyll's laboratory," Lanyon continued, "included several bottles of chemical preparations, a quantity of some crystalline powder, and a notebook filled with observations written in Jekyll's hand. The notebook appeared to document a series of experiments, though the scientific terminology was largely unfamiliar to me despite my medical training." "And the individual who came to collect these materials?" Utterson prompted. Lanyon's response was delayed by what appeared to be a struggle to find appropriate words for his experience. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality of horror that the lawyer had never heard from so composed and rational a man. "The person who arrived at my residence that evening," Lanyon said slowly, "was someone I had never encountered before, yet whose appearance inspired an immediate and profound revulsion. He was a man of perhaps 35 years, somewhat below average height, and possessed of features that seemed fundamentally wrong in some indefinable way." This description matched so closely with previous accounts of Edward Hyde that Utterson felt certain they were discussing the same individual. Yet Hyde was supposed to have fled London months earlier, and his presence in the city would represent a development of the most serious nature. "Are you certain," Utterson asked carefully, "that this visitor was not Edward Hyde, the individual wanted in connection with the Carew murder?" Lanyon's reaction to this question was immediate and explosive. "Edward Hyde," he exclaimed. "Yes, that was indeed the name he provided when I challenged his right to claim Jekyll's materials. But Gabriel, you must understand, this was not merely a criminal seeking to exploit my friend's generosity. What I witnessed that night defies every principle of medical science and natural philosophy I have spent my life studying." The physician resumed his restless pacing, and Utterson noted that his hands were trembling with increasing intensity. Whatever Lanyon had witnessed, it had clearly affected him profoundly, challenging not only his professional understanding but his fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality itself. "The man who called himself Hyde," Lanyon continued, "examined the materials I had retrieved with obvious familiarity. He prepared a solution using the chemicals in the crystalline powder, following procedures that demonstrated considerable knowledge of advanced chemistry. When the preparation was complete, he offered to demonstrate its effects, claiming that what I was about to see would compensate for any inconvenience I had suffered." Utterson leaned forward in his chair, sensing that the most crucial part of the account was approaching. "What did you observe?" Lanyon stopped pacing and faced the lawyer directly, his expression conveying the desperate sincerity of a man reporting events he knew would be difficult to believe. "Gabriel, I watched Edward Hyde consume that chemical preparation, and I witnessed the most extraordinary transformation that has ever occurred within the realm of human experience." The silence that followed this statement was broken only by the distant sounds of London's evening traffic and the steady tick of the clock on Utterson's mantelpiece. The lawyer waited patiently, knowing that his friend needed time to find words for an experience that apparently lay beyond normal human comprehension. "Before my eyes," Lanyon said finally, "Edward Hyde underwent a complete physical transformation. His stature increased, his features altered entirely, and within the space of perhaps 2 minutes, he had become a different person altogether. Gabriel, the man who stood before me after consuming that chemical preparation, was our mutual friend, Dr. Henry Jekyll." The implications of this revelation struck Utterson with the force of a physical blow. If Lanyon's account was accurate, it would explain every mysterious aspect of the relationship between Jekyll and Hyde, while simultaneously raising questions about the nature of human identity that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Victorian science and philosophy. "You are certain," Utterson said slowly, "that the individual who transformed before your eyes was indeed Henry Jekyll." "As certain as I am of my own identity," Lanyon replied without hesitation. "I have known Henry Jekyll since our university days, and I could not mistake his appearance, his voice, or his mannerisms. The man who stood before me after that terrible transformation was undoubtedly our friend, though how such a thing is possible lies entirely beyond my understanding." The physician sank into a chair, suddenly appearing exhausted by the effort of relating his extraordinary experience. Jekyll attempted to explain the scientific principles involved, he continued, but his account included theories about the dual nature of human consciousness that seemed to violate everything we understand about the relationship between mind and body. Utterson found himself struggling to accept the implications of what he had heard. If Jekyll had indeed discovered some means of physical transformation, it would represent a scientific breakthrough of unprecedented significance. Yet the moral and legal questions raised by such a discovery were equally staggering. Has Jekyll provided any explanation for why he developed this extraordinary capability? The lawyer asked. According to his account, Lanyon replied, he had become convinced that human nature contains both good and evil elements, and he sought to develop a means of separating these aspects of personality into distinct physical forms. The transformation I witnessed represented his ability to assume the physical appearance and psychological characteristics of what he described as his evil nature. This explanation provided a framework for understanding the relationship between Jekyll and Hyde, yet it raised disturbing questions about the extent to which the respected doctor might be responsible for Hyde's criminal activities. If Jekyll could indeed transform himself into Hyde at will, then the murder of Sir Danvers Carew took on an entirely different significance. "I have not slept peacefully since witnessing that transformation," Lanyon confessed. "The knowledge that such things are possible has fundamentally altered my understanding of human nature and scientific possibility. I fear that Jekyll has discovered something that was never meant to be known by mortal men." As the evening progressed, Utterson found himself grappling with the implications of his friend's account. The strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Edward Hyde had revealed itself to be far more complex and disturbing than he had ever imagined, and the questions it raised about human nature, scientific responsibility, and moral accountability would require careful consideration before any course of action could be determined. Outside, London's fog continued to thicken, creating an atmosphere that seemed entirely appropriate for contemplating mysteries that challenged the very foundations of rational thought. Chapter 6. The Remarkable Testimony of Mr. Poole. The revelation provided by Dr. Lanyon had left Gabriel Utterson in a state of profound intellectual and moral turmoil. For several days following their conversation, the lawyer found himself unable to concentrate on his professional duties, his mind repeatedly returning to the extraordinary claim that his respected friend, Dr. Jekyll, had somehow discovered the means to transform himself into the criminal Edward Hyde. Such a possibility violated every principle of natural philosophy that governed Victorian scientific understanding. Yet Lanyon's reputation for rational thinking and precise observation made it impossible to dismiss his testimony as mere fantasy or delusion. If the account was accurate, it would explain the mysterious connection between Jekyll and Hyde, while simultaneously raising questions about human nature that challenged the fundamental assumptions of civilized society. It was in this state of mental disturbance that Utterson received an unexpected visit from Poole, Dr. Jekyll's longtime manservant. The elderly retainer appeared at the lawyer's chambers on a cold March evening, his usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation and fear. Poole had been in Jekyll's service for more than 20 years, and Utterson had never seen him display such emotional distress. "Mr. Utterson, sir," Poole began without his customary formal greeting, "I must speak with you regarding my master's condition. Something terrible has happened at the house, and I fear for Dr. Jekyll's safety, perhaps even his life." The lawyer immediately invited Poole into his private study and offered him a chair near the fireplace. The manservant's hands were trembling, and his face bore the pallor of a man who had been deprived of sleep for several consecutive nights. "When did you last see Dr. Jekyll?" Utterson inquired. "That is precisely the difficulty, sir," Poole replied. "It has been 8 days since I have had any direct contact with my master, though I know he remains somewhere within the house." For more than a week, he has kept himself locked in his laboratory, refusing all visitors and communicating only through written notes passed beneath the door. This information alarmed Utterson considerably, for it suggested that Jekyll might be experiencing some form of mental or physical crisis that prevented him from maintaining normal social contact. What do these written communications contain? Requests for various chemical preparations, sir, Poole explained. My master has sent me to numerous chemists throughout London, seeking specific compounds and powders. When the materials I obtain fail to meet his requirements, he becomes extremely agitated and sends me to additional suppliers. The manservant reached into his coat and withdrew several crumpled papers. These are some of the notes he has written, sir. Perhaps you can make sense of what he requires, for I confess that his instructions have become increasingly difficult to understand. Utterson examined the documents by lamplight, immediately recognizing Jekyll's handwriting despite its unusually agitated quality. The notes contained requests for various chemical compounds, described in scientific terminology that suggested advanced knowledge of experimental chemistry. Most troubling were the repeated references to the importance of finding materials of absolute purity, and the desperate tone that characterized the later communications. Has Dr. Jekyll provided any explanation for his seclusion or his urgent need for these chemical preparations? The lawyer asked. None whatsoever, sir, Poole replied. When I attempt to engage him in conversation through the laboratory door, his responses are brief and often incomprehensible. Sometimes he speaks in a voice that scarcely resembles his own, and on several occasions I have heard sounds that suggest he may not be alone in the laboratory. This detail struck Utterson as particularly significant, given Lanyon's extraordinary account of Jekyll's ability to transform himself into another person. What sort of sounds have you observed? Poole hesitated before responding, as though struggling to describe phenomena that lay beyond his normal experience. Footsteps that seem too light to belong to my master, sir, and voices that suggest someone considerably younger and smaller than Dr. Jekyll. There have also been sounds that I can only describe as expressions of extreme distress, crying out in apparent pain or terror. The accumulation of these details painted a picture of circumstances that were clearly beyond Poole's ability to understand or manage. The loyal servant had obviously reached the limit of his endurance, and his decision to seek outside assistance demonstrated the seriousness of the situation. Poole, Utterson said gently, I believe the time has come for us to intervene directly in whatever crisis Dr. Jekyll is experiencing. If he is indeed in danger, we cannot allow misguided respect for his privacy to prevent us from providing necessary assistance. Relief was evident in the manservant's expression as he received this assurance of support. I have been hoping you would reach that conclusion, sir, for I confess that I am no longer capable of managing the situation alone. My master's behavior has become so erratic that I fear he may be suffering from some form of mental disturbance that requires medical attention. Utterson consulted his pocket watch and noted that the hour was approaching 9 o'clock in the evening. We shall go to Dr. Jekyll's residence immediately, he decided. If necessary, we will force entry to his laboratory to determine the nature of his condition and provide whatever assistance the situation requires. The carriage ride through London's fog-shrouded streets provided an opportunity for Poole to elaborate on the disturbing changes he had observed in his master's behavior. The manservant's account painted a picture of progressive deterioration, beginning with minor eccentricities and escalating to the current state of complete isolation and apparent desperation. For the past several months, Poole explained, Dr. Jekyll has spent increasing amounts of time in his laboratory, often remaining there throughout the night. His appetite has diminished considerably, and when he does take meals, he insists on having them delivered to the laboratory door rather than dining in the normal fashion. Has he received any visitors during this period? Utterson inquired. Very few, sir, and those only for brief consultations that were conducted in the laboratory rather than in the main house. I have noticed that after such visits, my master's agitation typically increases rather than diminishes. Jekyll's residence appeared normal from the street, with warm light visible in several windows and no obvious signs of disturbance. However, Poole led Utterson through the main house to the rear courtyard, where a separate building housed the doctor's laboratory and research facilities. The laboratory building was entirely dark except for a single window on the upper floor, where a dim light suggested that someone was indeed present within. As they approached the entrance, Both men could hear sounds that confirmed Poole's earlier observations, footsteps that seemed too quick and light to belong to Jekyll, and occasional utterances that suggested extreme emotional distress. Utterson knocked firmly on the laboratory door and called out to his friend, "Henry, this is Gabriel Utterson. Poole and I are concerned about your welfare, and we must speak with you immediately." The response came after a considerable delay, and when Jekyll's voice finally emerged from behind the locked door, it carried a quality that the lawyer had never heard before, high-pitched, strained, and filled with barely controlled panic. "Go away, Gabriel," the voice pleaded. "I cannot see anyone at present, and I must not be disturbed under any circumstances. Please leave immediately, and do not attempt to return." This response confirmed Utterson's worst fears about his friend's condition. "Henry, if you are ill or in danger, we must provide assistance. Your current behavior suggests that you may need medical attention or other forms of help that we can arrange." "No," came the immediate and emphatic reply. "No doctors, no visitors, no assistance of any kind. I am engaged in work that cannot be interrupted, and any interference could result in consequences that would be catastrophic for everyone involved." Poole stepped forward and addressed his master with the respectful familiarity that their long association permitted. "Dr. Jekyll, sir, I have been loyal to your service for more than 20 years, and I have never questioned your judgment or invaded your privacy. But the current situation has progressed beyond what any reasonable person could be expected to tolerate." The silence that followed this appeal lasted for several minutes, during which both men could hear movement within the laboratory that suggested someone pacing back and forth in obvious agitation. When Jekyll finally responded, his voice seemed to come from a different location, as though he had moved to a position farther from the door. "Poole, you have indeed been loyal beyond measure, and I am grateful for your service. But I must ask you to extend that loyalty one final time by respecting my need for absolute privacy. What I am attempting to accomplish requires complete isolation, and any interruption could prove disastrous." Utterson had heard enough to convince him that direct action was necessary, regardless of Jekyll's protests. "Henry, I am going to count to 10, and then Poole and I are going to force this door. If you are in danger, we must provide assistance. If you are engaged in activities that threaten public safety, we have an obligation to intervene." The lawyer began counting in a clear, firm voice, but before he reached the number 5, they heard the sound of rapid footsteps approaching the door from within. The lock turned with evident haste, and the door opened just wide enough to reveal a figure that both men immediately recognized, despite the extraordinary circumstances. Dr. Henry Jekyll stood before them, but his appearance was so altered that both Utterson and Poole required several moments to confirm his identity. The distinguished physician, who had always presented such a picture of health and professional competence, appeared to have aged decades in the space of a few months. Jekyll's hair had become largely gray, his face was gaunt and pale, and his clothes hung loosely on a frame that had obviously lost considerable weight. Most disturbing of all was the expression in his eyes, a haunted quality that suggested he had been subjected to experiences that had fundamentally altered his understanding of himself and the world around him. "Gabriel," Jekyll said in a voice that trembled with exhaustion, "I appreciate your concern, but you must understand that there are aspects of my current situation that I cannot discuss with anyone. The work I am pursuing has reached a critical stage, and any interruption could have consequences that extend far beyond my personal welfare." Despite his friend's protests, Utterson pushed past him into the laboratory, followed closely by the faithful Poole. What they discovered within that chamber of scientific research would challenge everything they believed about human nature, scientific possibility, and the thin boundary that separated civilized behavior from the darker impulses that lurked within every human heart. Chapter 7. The Last Night. The interior of Dr. Jekyll's laboratory presented a scene that immediately commanded the attention of both visitors. The spacious chamber, which had once housed carefully organized scientific equipment and meticulously arranged chemical preparations, now appeared to be in a state of controlled chaos that spoke of desperate experimentation conducted without regard for normal safety procedures. Tables that had previously displayed orderly arrays of glassware and measuring instruments were now covered with hastily assembled apparatus, bubbling retorts, and stained notebooks filled with observations written in Jekyll's increasingly erratic handwriting. The air itself carried a mixture of chemical odors, that suggested experiments of unusual complexity and potential danger. Most striking of all was the presence of a large mirror that had been positioned to face the central work area, as though Jekyll had found it necessary to observe his own appearance while conducting his research. The mirror's surface was cracked in several places, and its frame showed evidence of recent damage that might have resulted from being struck by thrown objects. Jekyll moved through this transformed space with the nervous energy of a man driven by circumstances beyond his control. His every gesture suggested someone operating under extreme pressure, constantly aware that time was running out for whatever project had consumed his life for the past several months. "Henry," Utterson said gently, "it is clear that you have been pushing yourself beyond reasonable limits. Whatever work you are pursuing here, it cannot justify the deterioration in your health and the obvious distress you are experiencing." Jekyll's laugh was bitter and entirely without humor. "My health, Gabriel, is the least of my concerns at present. I am engaged in a struggle that will determine not only my own survival, but the safety of everyone who has ever known me. The work you see here represents my only hope of resolving a situation that has progressed far beyond my ability to control through conventional means." Poole had begun examining the laboratory with the careful attention of someone who had maintained these facilities for many years. His expression grew increasingly troubled as he noted the various changes that had been made to equipment and procedures that had previously followed established scientific protocols. "Dr. Jekyll, sir," the manservant said respectfully, "I have observed your research activities for more than 2 decades, and I have never seen you work under conditions that appeared so irregular. If you are attempting to resolve some difficulty, perhaps there are colleagues who could provide assistance with whatever challenges you are facing." "No," Jekyll replied with immediate and emphatic horror. "No colleagues, no consultation, no involvement of any other person in what I am attempting to accomplish. The knowledge I have gained through my research must never be shared with anyone, for reasons that I pray you will never have cause to understand." The intensity of this response troubled Utterson deeply, for it suggested that his friend might be dealing with discoveries that posed threats extending far beyond personal danger. The lawyer's professional experience had taught him to recognize the signs of someone laboring under burdens too great for any individual to bear alone. "Henry," he said carefully, "if you have made discoveries that raise questions about public safety or moral responsibility, there may be legal and ethical obligations that require consultation with appropriate authorities. The isolation you have imposed upon yourself cannot be maintained indefinitely." Jekyll's reaction to this suggestion was immediate and violent. He began pacing the length of the laboratory with increasing agitation, his hands clenched into fists and his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "Authorities!" he exclaimed. "Gabriel, if the authorities were to learn what I have discovered, what I have done, what I have become, the consequences would be catastrophic not only for myself but for everyone who has ever been associated with me. The knowledge I possess must die with me, and I must ensure that it dies completely." This reference to ensuring the death of dangerous knowledge alarmed both visitors considerably. Utterson had encountered numerous clients whose research or business activities had led them into ethically questionable territory, but he had never before observed such desperate determination to prevent the disclosure of scientific discoveries. "What exactly have you discovered?" the lawyer asked directly. "What knowledge could possibly warrant such extraordinary measures to prevent its dissemination?" Jekyll stopped pacing and faced his visitors with an expression that combined desperation, guilt, and something that looked remarkably like terror. For several moments, he seemed to struggle with the question of how much he could safely reveal without creating additional dangers. "I have learned," he said finally, "that the human soul contains not one but 2 distinct natures, one devoted to good and the other to evil. Through chemical means, I have developed the ability to separate these aspects of personality, allowing each to exist independently in its own physical form." This confession confirmed the extraordinary account that Dr. Lanyon had provided, yet hearing it directly from Jekyll's own lips made the implications even more disturbing. If such a capability truly existed, it would represent a scientific breakthrough of unprecedented significance, while simultaneously raising moral questions that challenged the fundamental assumptions of civilized society. "You are saying," Utterson said slowly, "that you have discovered the means to transform yourself into another person entirely?" "Not another person," Jekyll corrected with obvious distress, but rather into the physical manifestation of my own evil nature. Edward Hyde is not a separate individual, but rather the embodiment of every dark impulse, every selfish desire, every capacity for cruelty that exists within my own character. The admission that Jekyll and Hyde were indeed the same person, as Lanyon had claimed, provided answers to many of the mysteries that had puzzled Utterson for months. Yet it also raised new questions about the extent to which Jekyll could be held responsible for Hyde's criminal activities. "Henry," the lawyer said carefully, "if you are indeed capable of transforming yourself into Edward Hyde, then you must understand that the murder of Sir Danvers Carew takes on an entirely different significance. The legal and moral implications of such a situation require immediate attention from appropriate authorities." Jekyll's response revealed the full extent of his anguish about the consequences of his scientific experimentation. "I am fully aware of my responsibility for Hyde's actions," he said quietly. "Every crime he has committed, every act of cruelty he has performed, represents the fulfillment of impulses that originated within my own character. I created him, and I must accept complete responsibility for everything he has done." This acceptance of moral accountability impressed Utterson despite the extraordinary circumstances, for it demonstrated that his friend retained the ethical principles that had always characterized his professional and personal conduct. "If you accept responsibility for Hyde's actions," the lawyer observed, "then you must also accept the obligation to ensure that he commits no future crimes. How do you propose to prevent additional harm to innocent people?" Jekyll moved to one of the work tables and withdrew a small vial containing a clear liquid. "This preparation," he explained, "represents my final hope of resolving the situation permanently. I have been working for months to perfect a formula that will eliminate Hyde entirely, allowing me to exist only in my original form." "And if this attempt fails?" Utterson inquired. "Then I must choose death rather than allow Hyde to continue his existence." Jekyll replied without hesitation, "I cannot permit my evil nature to cause additional harm to innocent people, regardless of the personal cost such a decision might entail." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that both visitors found deeply unsettling, a low growling that seemed to come from somewhere within the laboratory itself. Jekyll's reaction to this sound was immediate and panicked, suggesting that he recognized its significance and feared its implications. "You must leave immediately," he urged his visitors. "The transformation is beginning, and you must not be present when it reaches completion." Hyde's hatred for anyone associated with Henry Jekyll has grown beyond measure, and your safety cannot be guaranteed if he emerges while you remain here. Utterson was reluctant to abandon his friend during what appeared to be a moment of crisis, but the obvious terror in Jekyll's manner convinced him that their presence might indeed create additional dangers. "Henry, if this attempt to eliminate Hyde fails, you must promise to send for assistance rather than attempting to resolve the situation through self-destruction." "I promise nothing except that Edward Hyde will never again harm innocent people," Jekyll replied firmly. "Now go, quickly, before it is too late for any of us." As Utterson and Poole made their way back through the main house toward the street, both men carried with them the disturbing awareness that they had witnessed the final chapter in one of the most extraordinary and tragic cases in the annals of scientific research. The fog had thickened during their visit, and London's gas lamps created eerie pools of yellow light in the surrounding darkness. "Mr. Utterson," Poole said quietly as they reached the lawyer's carriage, "in all my years of service with Dr. Jekyll, I have never seen him in such a state of desperation. Whatever he attempts tonight, I fear the outcome will be tragic regardless of whether he succeeds or fails." The lawyer nodded gravely, for he shared the manservant's premonition that the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Edward Hyde was approaching its inevitable and sorrowful conclusion. As their carriage rolled through the fog-shrouded streets toward his chambers, Utterson found himself wondering whether the morning would bring news of his friend's success in eliminating his evil alter ego, or whether it would instead carry word of a tragedy that would forever alter his understanding of human nature and scientific possibility. Chapter 8. The Final Revelation. The night that followed Utterson's disturbing visit to Dr. Jekyll's laboratory proved to be one of the longest and most anxiety-filled of the lawyer's professional career. Unable to concentrate on any other matters, he spent the dark hours pacing his study and repeatedly consulting his pocket watch, as though the passage of time itself might provide some indication of his friend's fate. When dawn finally began to penetrate London's perpetual fog, Utterson had reached a state of nervous exhaustion that made further delay impossible. Despite the early hour, he directed his driver to take him immediately to Jekyll's residence, where he hoped to learn the outcome of the previous night's desperate experiment. The house appeared quiet and normal from the street, with no signs of disturbance that might indicate tragedy or violence. However, when Utterson knocked at the front door, it was opened not by Poole but by one of the underservants, whose expression immediately conveyed that something was seriously amiss. "Is Dr. Jekyll available to receive visitors?" the lawyer inquired, though he suspected from the servant's manner that such a meeting was unlikely to be possible. "I'm afraid not, sir," the young man replied nervously. "Mr. Poole has sent word that no one is to be admitted to the house under any circumstances, and that all inquiries should be directed to you as Dr. Jekyll's legal representative." This response confirmed Utterson's worst fears about the previous night's events. If Poole had indeed taken control of the household and was directing inquiries to the family lawyer, it suggested that some form of crisis had occurred that required immediate legal and practical attention. "Where is Mr. Poole at present?" Utterson asked. "In the laboratory building, sir. He has been there since the early hours of the morning, and he has given instructions that he is not to be disturbed except in cases of extreme emergency." Utterson made his way through the main house to the rear courtyard, where he found the laboratory building surrounded by several of Jekyll's household staff. Their expressions conveyed a mixture of curiosity and apprehension that suggested they were aware that something significant had occurred, but had not been informed of the specific details. The laboratory door stood open, and Utterson could see Poole moving about within the chamber with the careful, methodical efficiency that characterized his approach to all household crises. The faithful manservant looked up as the lawyer approached, and his expression immediately conveyed both relief at the arrival of legal assistance and sorrow at whatever discoveries he had been forced to confront. "Mr. Utterson," Poole said quietly, "I am grateful that you have come so quickly. I'm afraid the situation has reached its conclusion, though not in any manner that could have been anticipated or prevented." The lawyer entered the laboratory and immediately noted that the chaotic arrangement of chemical apparatus had been disturbed, with several pieces of glassware broken and various preparations spilled across the work surfaces. Most significantly, the large mirror that had dominated the central area now lay shattered on the floor, its fragments reflecting the morning light in sharp, dangerous patterns. "What exactly has occurred here?" Utterson inquired. Poole moved to a position near one of the work tables and gestured toward an object that the lawyer had not initially noticed. "I discovered this when I arrived at dawn to check on my master's condition," he explained. Following the manservant's gesture, Utterson observed what appeared to be a human form lying motionless on the floor near the shattered mirror. The figure was dressed in clothes that were too large for its slight frame, and its position suggested someone who had collapsed suddenly while in the midst of urgent activity. As Utterson approached for closer examination, he realized with growing horror that the deceased individual was unmistakably Edward Hyde. The repellent features that had been described by multiple witnesses were clearly visible, though death had somehow softened their impact and made them appear merely unfortunate rather than actively disturbing. "Edward Hyde is dead," Poole confirmed unnecessarily. "But, Mr. Utterson, there is no sign of Dr. Jekyll anywhere in the laboratory or in the main house. It is as though my master has simply vanished, leaving behind only this individual whose presence here defies all reasonable explanation." The implications of this discovery struck Utterson with the force of revelation. If Jekyll's experiment had indeed been successful in eliminating Hyde permanently, and if the two men were truly the same person in different physical forms, then Hyde's death might represent not murder, but rather a form of controlled scientific suicide. "Have you found any written explanation for these events?" the lawyer asked. "Indeed I have, sir," Poole replied, producing a sealed envelope that bore Utterson's name in Jekyll's familiar handwriting. This was positioned prominently on the main work table, obviously intended to be discovered and delivered to you without delay. Utterson accepted the envelope with hands that trembled slightly from both exhaustion and apprehension. The weight and thickness of the contents suggested a substantial document, and the formality of its presentation indicated that Jekyll had prepared this communication with considerable care. "I believe," Poole said respectfully, "that Dr. Jekyll intended this letter to provide whatever explanations and instructions might be necessary for managing the aftermath of his final experiment. He clearly anticipated that you would be called upon to handle the legal and practical consequences of whatever occurred here. The lawyer carefully opened the envelope and discovered not one but two documents. The first was a brief note addressed to him personally, while the second appeared to be a much longer manuscript written in Jekyll's hand, but bearing the formal characteristics of a legal confession or testimonial statement. The brief note read simply, "Gabriel, the longer document contains my complete confession regarding the Edward Hyde affair and the scientific discoveries that made his existence possible. I ask only that you read it carefully before deciding how much of its contents should be shared with legal authorities or the general public. Your discretion regarding these matters will determine whether my life's work contributes to human knowledge or merely serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of scientific hubris." Utterson examined the longer manuscript, noting that it bore the title, "The Full Statement of the Case by Dr. Henry Jekyll," and appeared to contain a detailed account of the scientific experiments and personal experiences that had led to the current tragic conclusion. "Poole," the lawyer said thoughtfully, "I believe it would be appropriate for me to read Dr. Jekyll's complete statement before determining how to proceed with official notification of these events. The unusual circumstances require careful consideration of how much information should be immediately shared with police authorities." The manservant nodded with obvious relief. "I was hoping you would reach that conclusion, sir. The household staff are aware that something significant has occurred, but they have not been informed of the specific details. I thought it best to await your arrival before making any decisions about official notifications." Utterson spent the remainder of the morning in Jekyll's study, carefully reading through the extraordinary document that his friend had prepared as his final testimony. What he discovered within those pages would challenge everything he had previously believed about human nature, scientific possibility, and the relationship between good and evil within the human character. The confession began with Jekyll's earliest childhood observations about the dual nature of his own personality, describing his growing awareness that he possessed both noble impulses toward service and charity, and darker desires for pleasure and power that he had always struggled to control through conventional moral discipline. As a young medical student, Jekyll had become fascinated by the scientific possibilities of separating these conflicting aspects of human nature, imagining that such separation might allow individuals to pursue both good and evil impulses without the internal conflict that characterized normal moral experience. Years of chemical research had eventually led to the development of a preparation that could indeed accomplish this separation, allowing Jekyll to transform himself into a physical embodiment of his evil nature while preserving his original form as the repository of his better impulses. The early experiments with this transformation had filled Jekyll with a sense of liberation and scientific triumph. Edward Hyde, as he named his alternative form, possessed all of Jekyll's intelligence and education, but none of his moral restraints or social obligations. Through Hyde, Jekyll could pursue pleasures and experiences that his respectable position made impossible, always with the knowledge that he could return to his original form and reputation whenever he chose. However, as the confession revealed, this apparent scientific triumph had gradually developed into something far more dangerous and uncontrollable than Jekyll had ever anticipated. The transformations became more frequent and more difficult to resist, as though Hyde's evil nature was growing stronger and more dominant with each episode. More troubling still, Jekyll began to discover that his original personality was being corrupted by his experiences as Hyde. The evil impulses that had previously been suppressed by moral discipline were now being actively exercised and strengthened, making it increasingly difficult to maintain his respectable facade even when in his original form. The confession detailed numerous incidents of cruelty and violence committed by Hyde, culminating in the murder of Sir Danvers Carew during a fit of inexplicable rage. Jekyll's horror at this crime had motivated his desperate attempts to eliminate Hyde permanently, but by this time, the evil personality had become so strong that it could emerge spontaneously without the use of chemical preparations. The final pages of the document describe Jekyll's growing realization that he was losing the ability to control the transformations, and that Hyde's hatred for Jekyll's attempts to suppress him had grown to the point where he posed a mortal threat not only to Jekyll himself, but to anyone associated with the doctor's respectable life. The last entry in the confession, dated only hours before Utterson's discovery of Hyde's body, revealed Jekyll's decision to use the final dose of his transformational chemical not to become Hyde. but to ensure that Hyde's form would be the one that remained when the effects of the preparation wore off permanently. "I take up my pen for the last time in my original character," Jekyll had written. "In half an hour, when I shall again and forever assume the hated personality of Edward Hyde, I know that I shall sit shuddering and weeping in my chair, or continue to pace the floor with the wild gestures of a guilty and tormented soul. Yet I face this final transformation with relief, for it represents the only means of ensuring that my evil nature dies with me, taking to the grave the terrible knowledge that created him." As Utterson completed his reading of this extraordinary confession, he found himself grappling with questions about human nature and scientific responsibility that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Edward Hyde had revealed itself to be not merely a criminal matter, but a profound meditation on the duality that existed within every human heart, and the dangers that awaited those who sought to resolve that duality through means that were never intended for mortal comprehension. Outside, London continued its daily routine, unaware that one of its most respected citizens had discovered and paid the ultimate price for knowledge that challenged the very foundations of human understanding. The fog that perpetually shrouded the great city seemed an entirely appropriate atmosphere for contemplating mysteries that lay beyond the reach of conventional wisdom. And the lawyer wondered whether the world would be better served by the complete suppression of Jekyll's discoveries, or by their careful dissemination as a warning to future generations of scientific researchers. Chapter 9. The Final Accounting. In the weeks following the discovery of Edward Hyde's body and the reading of Dr. Jekyll's complete confession, Gabriel Utterson found himself facing the most complex legal and moral challenge of his professional career. The extraordinary circumstances revealed by his friend's final statement raised questions that extended far beyond conventional criminal law into areas of scientific ethics and human nature that had no established legal precedents. After careful consideration of all available options, Utterson made the decision to present a carefully edited version of events to the police authorities. The official account described Edward Hyde as a criminal associate who had gained influence over Dr. Jekyll through some form of blackmail or coercion, and whose death appeared to have resulted from suicide following the completion of his final criminal act. This explanation satisfied the immediate requirements of legal closure, while avoiding the more extraordinary aspects of Jekyll's confession that would have been impossible for authorities to accept or verify. Inspector Newcomen expressed satisfaction that the Carew murder case could finally be closed, though he noted that the complete disappearance of Dr. Jekyll remained a troubling mystery that might never be fully resolved. The household at Jekyll's residence was disbanded with appropriate compensation for all staff members, and the property itself was eventually sold to settle the doctor's financial obligations. Poole, whose loyalty and discretion had been absolute throughout the crisis, was provided with a substantial pension that would ensure his comfortable retirement from service. Dr. Lanyon's health continued to deteriorate following his shocking encounter with Jekyll's transformation, and he passed away quietly in his sleep some 3 months after the laboratory incident. His final words to Utterson expressed the hope that humanity would never again approach the dangerous knowledge that his colleague had discovered through years of misguided scientific investigation. The chemical apparatus and experimental notes found in Jekyll's laboratory were destroyed under Utterson's supervision, ensuring that the dangerous formulations could never be recreated by future researchers who might be tempted to repeat Jekyll's experiments. The lawyer felt a profound responsibility to prevent the dissemination of knowledge that had proven so catastrophic in the hands of even so responsible a scientist as Henry Jekyll. As the months passed, and London society gradually forgot the mysterious disappearance of Dr. Jekyll and the criminal activities of Edward Hyde, Utterson found himself increasingly troubled by the broader implications of what he had learned. The confession had revealed that the capacity for both good and evil existed within every human character, and that the thin veneer of civilization was all that prevented respectable individuals from acting upon their darkest impulses. This knowledge had a profound effect upon the lawyer's practice and his relationships with clients and colleagues. He found himself observing human behavior with new awareness of the internal conflicts that drove people's actions, and he developed a deeper appreciation for the moral restraints that enabled civilized society to function despite the presence of destructive impulses within every human heart. The complete text of Jekyll's confession remained in Utterson's private safe, where it would stay until his own death many years later. In his will, the lawyer specified that the document should be sealed for 100 years before being made available to future generations, who might be better equipped to understand its implications and guard against its dangers. The strange case had taught Utterson that some forms of knowledge were too dangerous for immediate dissemination, and that the responsibility for protecting humanity from its own discoveries was as important as the pursuit of scientific advancement itself. The price of Jekyll's investigations had been not only his own life, but the corruption of his fundamental nature and the creation of a separate evil entity whose existence had threatened the safety of innocent people. In his final professional years, Utterson often reflected upon the question of whether Jekyll's discoveries represented a genuine scientific breakthrough or merely the delusions of a mind that had been corrupted by its own research. The physical evidence of the transformations had been witnessed by reliable observers, yet the implications were so extraordinary that they challenged the basic assumptions upon which Victorian science was founded. The lawyer eventually concluded that the truth of Jekyll's claims was less important than the moral lessons they provided about the dangers of attempting to separate good and evil through artificial means. Human nature, he came to believe, was designed to contain both impulses in constant tension, and any attempt to resolve that tension through external intervention was likely to result in the corruption of both aspects of personality. The fog-shrouded streets of London continued to conceal their share of mysteries and secrets, but none that Utterson encountered in his remaining years proved as disturbing or as instructive as the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Edward Hyde. The lawyer carried the knowledge of those extraordinary events as a private burden, using it to guide his professional decisions and his understanding of human nature, without ever revealing the full truth to anyone else. When Gabriel Utterson died peacefully in his chambers many years later, he was surrounded by the legal documents and case files that represented a lifetime of service to London's citizens. Among those documents, carefully secured in his private safe, was the complete confession of Dr. Henry Jekyll, a testament to the dangers of scientific hubris and the terrible price that awaited those who sought to remake human nature according to their own designs. The sealed confession would wait in darkness for the specified century, carrying its warning across the generations to future scientists who might be tempted to pursue similar investigations. Whether that warning would be heeded or ignored would depend upon the wisdom and moral restraint of researchers yet unborn, who would face their own temptations to exceed the boundaries that separated legitimate scientific inquiry from dangerous experimentation with the fundamental nature of human existence. Epilogue: The Enduring Mystery. 100 years after the events chronicled in this account, the sealed confession of Dr. Henry Jekyll was finally opened by scholars who had spent decades preparing for the responsibility of evaluating its contents. The document was examined by teams of scientists, philosophers, and historians who brought to bear all the accumulated knowledge of a century of advancement in chemistry, psychology, and medical science. Their conclusions were varied and often contradictory. Some argued that Jekyll's account represented an early case study in what would later be understood as multiple personality disorder, with the chemical transformations serving as elaborate theatrical props to support psychological delusions. Others suggested that the confession might be an entirely fictional narrative, created by a brilliant mind that had been driven to madness by guilt over criminal activities that could not be openly acknowledged. However, a minority of researchers remained convinced that Jekyll's claims might represent genuine scientific phenomena that lay beyond the current understanding of human biology and consciousness. They pointed to the detailed chemical formulations described in the confession, many of which involved compounds that had only recently been discovered or synthesized by modern science. These researchers also noted the consistency of witness testimony from reliable observers who had reported physical transformations that could not be explained by conventional medical knowledge. The account provided by Dr. Lanyon, in particular, seemed too specific and technically detailed to be dismissed as mere fantasy or delusion. The debate over Jekyll's confession would continue for many years, with each generation of scientists bringing new perspectives and methodologies to bear upon the extraordinary claims it contained. Some viewed it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated scientific experimentation, while others saw it as a profound exploration of the dual nature that characterized all human personality. What remained undisputed was the moral lesson embedded within Jekyll's tragic story. Regardless of whether his transformations were real or imagined, his account provided a powerful warning about the consequences of attempting to separate good and evil through artificial means. The pursuit of such separation had led not to the liberation he had sought, but to the corruption of his entire character and the creation of evil that threatened everyone around him. Modern readers of the Confession were struck by its relevance to contemporary discussions about genetic engineering, pharmaceutical enhancement of human performance, and other scientific developments that promise to alter fundamental aspects of human nature. Jekyll's story served as a reminder that such alterations might produce unintended consequences that could prove catastrophic for both individuals and society. The fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London had given way to the bright lights and constant surveillance of a modern metropolis. Yet the fundamental questions raised by Jekyll's experiments remained as relevant as ever. The capacity for both good and evil continued to exist within every human heart, and the temptation to resolve that internal conflict through technological means continued to attract those who believed that science could improve upon the basic design of human nature. Whether future generations would prove wiser than Dr. Jekyll in their approach to such temptations remained an open question. His confession stood as both a warning and a challenge, a reminder of the terrible price that awaited those who ventured too far beyond the boundaries of legitimate scientific inquiry, and an invitation to consider whether some forms of knowledge were too dangerous for humanity to possess. The strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Edward Hyde had begun as a mystery involving criminal activities in the darker districts of London, but it had revealed itself to be something far more profound, a meditation on the nature of human identity, the responsibilities of scientific investigation, and the thin line that separated civilized behavior from the chaotic impulses that lurked within every human soul. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson of Jekyll's tragedy was not the specific details of his scientific discoveries, but rather the recognition that human nature itself was not a problem to be solved through chemical or technological intervention. The tension between good and evil impulses that characterized normal human experience was not a flaw to be corrected, but rather an essential aspect of what made individuals capable of moral choice and ethical development. The fog that had once concealed the activities of Edward Hyde in Victorian London had finally lifted, revealing truths about human nature that would continue to challenge and instruct readers for generations to come. Dr. Jekyll's final gift to humanity was not the dangerous knowledge he had developed, but rather the warning he had provided about the consequences of attempting to transcend the moral limitations that defined human existence. His story would endure as one of literature's most powerful explorations of the duality that existed within every human heart, serving as both entertainment and instruction for those who sought to understand the complex relationship between scientific ambition and moral responsibility. The strange case would continue to fascinate readers who recognized in Jekyll's struggle with his own nature a reflection of the eternal human challenge of choosing between good and evil impulses that competed for dominance within every human soul. Thus concluded the extraordinary account of Dr. Henry Jekyll and Edward Hyde, a tale that began with a simple observation about human nature and evolved into one of the most profound and disturbing investigations ever undertaken into the fundamental questions of identity, morality, and the price of knowledge that was never intended for human comprehension. And so concludes our journey through Robert Louis Stevenson's timeless masterpiece, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a tale that has haunted readers for more than a century, with its profound exploration of the duality that exists within every human heart. From the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London to the final tragic revelation in Jekyll's laboratory, we have witnessed one of literature's most powerful meditations on the nature of good and evil, and the terrible price that awaits those who seek to transcend the moral limitations that define human existence. Through the methodical investigation of Gabriel Utterson, the loyal service of Poole, and the devastating testimony of Dr. Lanyon, we have seen how scientific ambition without moral restraint can lead not to enlightenment, but to destruction. Jekyll's confession stands as both a thrilling mystery and a profound warning about the dangers of attempting to remake human nature according to our own designs. Thank you for joining us here at Quick Classic Books, where we bring you the greatest works of literature with the careful attention to detail and narrative excellence that these timeless stories deserve. Stevenson's exploration of human duality remains as relevant today as it was in 1886, reminding us that the struggle between our noble impulses and darker desires is the eternal human condition, one that defines not only individual character, but the very foundation of civilized society. If you've enjoyed this adaptation of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we invite you to explore our complete library of classic literature narrations. From the Gothic mysteries of Edgar Allan Poe to the social commentaries of Charles Dickens, from the romantic adventures of Alexandre Dumas to the philosophical depths of Fyodor Dostoevsky, Quick Classic Books transforms the world's greatest stories into engaging experiences that honor both the original author's intentions and modern listeners' appreciation for literary excellence. The fog that once concealed the activities of Edward Hyde in Victorian London has lifted, but the questions raised by his existence continue to challenge and instruct us. In an age when scientific advancement promises to unlock ever greater secrets of human nature, Jekyll's tragedy serves as a crucial reminder that some boundaries should never be crossed, and that the pursuit of knowledge must always be tempered by wisdom and moral responsibility. Subscribe to Quick Classic Books to continue your journey through the masterworks that have shaped our understanding of human nature, moral responsibility, and the complex relationship between civilization and the darker impulses that lurk within every human soul. Until our next literary adventure, remember that the greatest stories are those that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves, and in that confrontation, perhaps find the wisdom to choose the better angels of our nature. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde reminds us that we all carry within ourselves the capacity for both creation and destruction, for healing and harm, for nobility and corruption. The choice of which nature we nurture and express remains, thankfully, our own, a responsibility that neither science nor circumstance can take away from the human heart that beats within every reader's chest. Thank you for experiencing this classic tale with Quick Classic Books, where literature lives on